tarde de hoy con el recibimiento al profesor John Arthos. Le queremos agradecer especialmente que haya aceptado nuestra invitación, porque lo que nos va a presentar hoy convoca a muchas áreas, a muchas personas que estamos ocupadas y trabajando en educación, en formación. Entonces es un agradecimiento especial porque creemos que su conferencia de hoy o su presentación de hoy va a dar lugar a esto que para el centro es fundamental, y que es el diálogo entre los distintos saberes, y tratar de no quedarnos como en un tecnicismo muy digamos, muy específico, bueno, que por momentos hace difícil ese diálogo. Así que leyendo sus trabajos estamos muy contentos por esta conferencia que nos va a dar, y por el diálogo que se va a plantear después de su conferencia, que siempre acostumbramos a abrir esa ronda que decimos de consultas, preguntas, comentarios, y bueno, así conocernos un poco más también. Carlos, no sé si querés agregar algo o empezamos la presentación ya directamente. Bien,
Okay.
Marina, entonces te doy la palabra.
Thank you, Laura. Professor John Arthur, it's a real pleasure to have you here among us today, and that you had so generously accepted Professor Ruta's invitation, the head of the Center of Hermeneutic Studies, to share such a provoking perspective for all of us who are in the field of education. Right? I will introduce you formally, briefly, very briefly. Dr. John Arthos is a professor in the Department of English at Indiana University Bloomington, and is also the director of the required college basic public speaking course. His research focuses on the reciprocity of hermeneutics and rhetoric. He's the author of several monographs and many journal essays. Today, he will be talking about Out of the Cave of Cyclops, using hermeneutics as a theoretical framework for the undergraduate humanities, social and political sciences curriculum. Well, Professor, we're sure all been enlightened by such an interesting and deep, thought-provoking presentation. The floor is yours. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you all very much, and all the work that you're helping to make this legible to everybody. So I'm hoping that you see now my first slide, which is just the
Sí, se ve perfectamente. We can see it.
Yes.
Profesor, tiene el micrófono silenciado.
You are silenced, John. Professor, you're silenced. You're muted.
okay. Okay, so you should be able to hear me now. Okay, all right. So in my little abstract that I presented in my postcard, I outlined the fading status of hermeneutics in the United States after a brief moment of in the sun, with Gadamer and with Ricoeur both. But I myself see this fashion, this movement up and down of fashion, as only a very local phenomenon in the long arc of the disciplines, since they belong to this very long history, rhetoric to a millennium history, and hermeneutics to a 500-year-old history. And I see along with Gadamer, I see the inflection point between rhetoric and hermeneutics occurring around the time of Luther. But both of these disciplines, sort of in tandem, have been traveling along quietly underneath a kind of, as a kind of pesky gadfly, underneath the dominant paradigms of rationalism and positivism. And my gamble is that if hermeneutics remains attached to rhetoric as sort of the indispensable theoretical resource and pedagogy that it is in the academy, that they can both survive for a long time into the future. So that's why I chose this path in my own career. I've dived right into the bosom of the general education curriculum, specifically into the undergraduate introductory pedagogy courses. And that's a responsibility, I should tell you, that most senior faculty here run as far away from as they possibly can. But my own belief about this is that that's where rhetoric and hermeneutics go when they have to settle, when they have to go into hibernation for a while, as is likely to happen. So I teach the basic competencies of speaking and reading and writing, and I'm very, very proud to do that. So this is a picture of my campus. I became the director of the speech course here. We're in a Midwestern area, Indiana, with the goal of returning the basic human competence of speech and language to its full integrity as rhetorical and hermeneutic arts. And that's what I've been doing here at Indiana for about 9 years. Now, here's a little map of what I'm going to go through. Like my title suggests, and that's the cyclops in the cave, examining the sheep as they pass through, but he only examines them from the top, of course. I use the conceit of Odysseus passing his troops through out under the watchful eye of the cyclops as a metaphor for the strategy that I use in teaching these courses, because what I want to show you is how I weave a hermeneutic rhetoric into the deepest reaches of the humanistic tradition with everything I teach. So you'll want me to define my key terms, so I'll do that for you now. I want to spend a little time with both rhetoric and hermeneutics. Too many of us, I'm afraid, in the academy and outside the academy, hold on to a quite degraded and reductive idea of rhetoric as often a slick, instrumental persuasion, as message management, how to win friends and influence people, as they say here. And I can tell you that this stereotype is anathema to the people in the discipline of rhetoric studies here in the United States, which has a very rich tradition, and especially in the Midwest, in the land-grant colleges where I work. It's still very present to us in our institutional history that there was a 19th century agrarian movement here to fund basic literacy and educational outreach to the rural poor. And they focused on the basic competencies, right? So if a community recognizes the demand for speech and writing as a human exigence deeply rooted in our public lives, rather than just as a tool knowledge, you can understand how we get to the following now famous definition of rhetoric that I'm going to read you here on the screen. We are dealing no longer with a specialized technique of instrumental communication, but rather with a general condition of human experience and action. And as many of you know, both Heidegger and Gadamer recognized the paradigmatic implication of rhetoric, as the practice of our discursive being, as logos, right? And my work springs from this double origin, both the practice and then the theory. Now, this broadening of rhetoric doesn't fully capture its complexity in the way that I use it. So I have to parse it into 3 registers as I have listed here. So they would be first as a characteristic approach to a public issue of concern. Second, in its disciplinary vocabularies, sort of the canons, right? The offices of style and composition and invention and so forth, and as a sort of as a storehouse of linguistic and symbolic resources. And then 3, as a paradigm of thinking, which communicating and being, that contrasts with the rationalist philosophy that developed really as a rejection of humanist rhetorical prudence after the Renaissance. So I'm going to fill out those 3 categories a little bit so you understand what I mean by that. The first is, when I say rhetorical approach, I'm thinking of the things that academics often have in mind when they're referring to the sensitivity to the mutual implication of the many variables that are involved in any kind of deliberative situation. And I have them here pictured for you: audience, speaker, message, text, context. And there's a subtle interplay and a reciprocity among these variables that work both through our conscious adjustment and then over and above our willing and doing, as Gadamer says. Such a conception of communication is worlds apart from the standard linear transmission model of communication, sort of more oriented from the social sciences, right? Or in philosophy, in traditional philosophy, as sort of the logic of the proposition, right? And so the rhetoric is pushing back against both. This is a graphic that I once created to show, I was trying to show sort of the fluid and animating complexity of rhetoric as a repertoire of tools for the ongoing adjustment of all the parts of a deliberative process. And this is just, here is just a list of the parts of the canon. I'm very partial to Michael Leff's definition of rhetoric. So here I'll say it to you. It's a storehouse of flexible resources, responses to indeterminate and contingent exigencies, infinitely adaptable, layered, open, flexible, and generative. You could spend your life in any one of these canons here. In fact, you could argue that the whole of continental philosophy is grounded in just one of them, the 3rd canon, Lexis. So it's a very, very rich repertoire. And then finally, my 3rd register, and I'm showing here some of the authors that I draw this from, because rhetoric is conceived as the competence to engage with each of us together in community to resolve issues that matter to us, and is anchored in the particularity of its historical and cultural circumstance. It stands as an alternative to the epistemic frames that are somehow insulated from our embodied selves in some kind of abstract theoretical space of reasoning. I think you hear me channeling Gadamer, right? It was Gadamer and Grossi who taught me that hermeneutics picked up the baton from rhetoric to teach this lesson. Now, what about hermeneutics? My perspective on this is rooted in Gadamer mainly, but also the 500 years of disciplinary history I spoke about, and in addition, the propulsive forward movement of hermeneutics through Ricoeur's hermeneutics of hope and suspicion, and then beyond that to something even more capacious. But my sense is that hermeneutics will need to enrich its theoretical range beyond Gadamer and Ricoeur and Heidegger and Derrida and Levinas if it wants to regain its currency for future generations. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that. Most hermeneutics today come out of philosophy or religion, not rhetoric. So this emphasis on rhetoric might sound strange to the ear. But as you know, as you may know, Friedrich Schleiermacher saw rhetoric and hermeneutics as two balanced and co-equal arts. Production and reception, right? Writing and interpreting. I have myself arrived at a somewhat different sense of their collaboration. And this is through Gadamer. I've argued that rhetoric is the practice and hermeneutics the theory of our conversations, debates, deliberations. And in this configuration, rhetoric comprehends both listening and speaking, right? The entire scene of communicative exchange, while hermeneutics pays particular attention to and accounts for a particular way in which this exchange takes place, okay? To the way in which the scene, in the broadest sense, cultural, linguistic, historical, precedes and shapes any specific communication, and notes how such conventional forces are often interrupted by contingencies, by the unanticipated views of other folks, by everything we, from our limited perspectives, can not anticipate, right? And so reconfigures that scene as we go. So hermeneutics, for me, is not a theory outside of communicative exchange, but one that we as communicators develop as a reflective awareness over our own practices. Okay, so that's a very condensed background for my orientation. It's a sort of syncretic reading of a long humanist tradition that's not original with me, and it gives tremendous scope to many general education courses that I teach now. And here are the three that I wanted to introduce you to today. I'm going to explore with you, with each of these ones, a separate hermeneutic element. First, the historical with the first course, then the social with the second course, and then the ontological with the third course. And I'll start with law. Next spring, I'm teaching this course for the second time. And I teach this to undergrad students. We have a pre-law program here. And I use rhetorical and hermeneutic principles to teach them about constitutional law as it relates to our own, especially US Constitution. And to make this subject come alive for them, I have students role play appellate and Supreme Court cases, and then perform oral arguments in a courtroom setting, and then write majority or dissenting opinions for their term paper. So it's a very practical course in which they sort of get a practice at being lawyers and judges. The premise of this course, and I've put the theorists here who are working in this area, is backed up by the scholarly work you see here. And the idea is that case law practice based on precedent is essentially a hermeneutic rhetoric, right? I'm not trying to make students see the second order linkage necessarily. I don't know that they would really care about that, but rather I'm trying to help them understand in embodied practice, right? By standing up and speaking with each other, the hermeneutic principles that work in law as something that lives between textuality and life, and that it is literally that reciprocal interpenetration of text and life in text. So here, now this is one of those all-in-one slides. It's my summary of that connection between life and text in a hermeneutics understanding. And it involves a couple of legal principles that undergird our constitutional theory of law in the States. It's the dialectic of stare decisis, which is, and I'm going to define that, the benefit of the doubt accorded to established case law. That's stare decisis. And this is the second principle, precedent, which is the prudent exception to convention that a new situation allows. Those are the two legal principles. And together, this is the practice by which the court interprets constitutional principles. It's effectively an application of, my contention is, and I think Gadamer would also say this, the hermeneutic circle of understanding, right? So case law, as distinct from statutory law, is based on the variability of the particular situation and on the historicality of judgment itself, right? Judgment in situ, which judgment in situ compensates for the weakness of the statutory authority of legal codes to anticipate every circumstance. And this moves away from a system of classification, right, which Gadamer ridiculed as pigeonhole thinking, to a more generous social wisdom or phronesis in which each new social judgment shapes the law itself. That's the key idea here. And that's the hard part for students to wrap their brain around. So we work through it, this idea all through the semester, that the decisions that we make in applying the law change the law. Pretty obviously, the course relies on Gadamer's analogy between hermeneutic understanding and legal interpretation, right? It's really his privileged example in Truth and Method. Here's a quote, direct quote from him. You don't have to read the whole thing. I think that highlighted portion is the key one. Our constitutional law system, regardless of what most analytic scholars in law say, is in effect what Gadamer teaches in Truth and Method. In a very specific section in the middle of the book, in which he passes the Aristotelian principle of prudential judgment through a kind of Hegelian filter of historical emergence. Okay, so I take students through a little legal history at the beginning of the course, how constitutional jurisprudence, as it's evolved, has very, very deep roots. Since the dialogue between stare decisis and precedent is really only a modern version of the medieval doctrine of casuistry in church law, right? Where the complex institutional politics of sin and judgment, as it developed, needed a measure of prudential flexibility, right? The casuists saw, under the pressure of so much sin, that a particular new situation might reveal something that the law and its textual expression originally would need to accommodate, and that this casuistry taught us all eventually that a good law, because it's a statement of principle in history, has to have the breathing room to have this kind of dialogue with culture and history. And then I also show students how English common law was a further concretization of the precedent theory of practical judgment of Aristotle in the way that it accommodated the legal codes to changing customs. Maybe it was because the British were always a bit more pragmatic, that the Anglophone tradition developed more in this common law mode, as distinct from mainland Europe, which was more under civic law, which had more to do with codes and with subsumption of instances under codes. But in any case, what hermeneutics clarifies about the casuistic method is that the history of law, as it's embodied in constitutional interpretation, is the unfolding of the law itself. Right? So this is not what constitutional law is, coming down from the mountains on the tablets. The law isn't some universal under which particulars are subsumed, and an instance doesn't just fit like the bed of Crocustes into some predetermined categories, right? Which is this notion that Gadamer so despises of subsumption under the category. Now, as you guys probably know, we are running into some problems up here with our Supreme Court. They're busy throwing out all of this precedent theory out the window. That's going to make the spring term really, really interesting for me, and probably also for the students, because Roe, the decision to overturn Roe, is very, very present to all of them, right? And I can show students in this context very clearly with our Constitution that the founding document, the one that lasts, has its unanticipated future history built into its structure, right? So the meaning all men, for example, in the phrase all men are created equal, as a founding document, continues to grow and change its meaning for us. And that's because language has that kind of elasticity, right? Now, if that's all that my law course teaches students, that's from my point of view, well worth it. That's a lot to digest and work through if you're 19. So we get at it gradually over the course of the semester. We start out with, and I'm showing you the reading here, a story about how the clear and present danger doctrine of free speech developed in the life experience and the cultural history of a Supreme Court justice. Oliver Wendell Holmes literally changed his mind about this all-important doctrine based upon his experience with his friends. He had a Jewish friend who was persecuted for his speech. And then what really happens, what really helps get this hermeneutic principle across to students is all the practical examples that they themselves choose and explore of precedent law all the way through the course. So they pick their own cases and explore them and present them to each other. And then I help them interpret that through this hermeneutic lens that I'm developing. And then for their final project, I have them stage a mock Supreme Court hearing to practice their lawyerly skills. And I'll play you a little bit of the, just a very tiny little bit of a few seconds of what it sounds like in court. I hope you can hear this.
Pretty clear that the court, the state does not know what specifically they are looking for. And if they did know what they were looking for, they would be able to go through a third party to get that information. So,
well, it seems pretty clear to me when the state was up on the stand, we're looking for more calls and messages from SAO to DS.
So that was an appeals court judge interrogating an attorney, Abby, an attorney. And the students loved this part of the semester. Usually the final period is what they dread, but in this case, they were really looking forward to it. Now, here you can see on one side are those topics, and then here is a student final paper. I have them actually do it in the format of a decision, right, of an opinion. And they use all the conventions of an official opinion. And so again, that sort of, it reinforces the way in which this theoretical understanding that they're trying to wrap their brains around has these very practical applications. And because some of them are pre-law, they're really, really interested in that. Okay, so that's the law course. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the course I'm teaching right now, which I actually rename, even though the catalog is called Visual Rhetoric, I call it the Film Narrative Workshop, because I have students looking at the language of film and television. And I want to show you how I use Paul Ricoeur's narrative theory to inform a film appreciation and theory course. Gadamer does it, sort of ignores narrative, and Ricoeur gives us that. And so you really need him to integrate hermeneutics into a curriculum such as ours that features narrative and ethics, and also the political as much as our program does. Instead of just teaching film grammar or narrative logic or genre devices, I use the pleasure of narrative consumption as a lever to help students see how they're constituted as temporal beings. So Ricoeur's famous book is called Time and Narrative. It's a theory about the temporality that narrative creates for human beings. So temporal beings who inhabit fabricated worlds that feed and respond to our imagined needs and desires in structured ways That is his idea that narrative structures our living and understanding and feeling. And his theory is that narratives are effectively equipment for living. Okay, imaginative variations on possible worlds, or laboratories of ethical experimentation, or reconfigurations of our, what he calls mute, confused temporal experience into something more ordered and habitable. And the means by which, as we try to understand our lives, a stable figure is drawn from a temporal succession, is how he puts it. So conventionally, imaginative discourse gathers together, and if you think about things as heterogeneous as characters and actions and motives, into a kind of meaningful whole, right? And scenes, right? This is the heterogeneity of things that are somehow brought together by narrative. But then this course goes quite deep, right, into the function of narrative for us as human beings. It isn't just an imaginative structuring of life, but a mimetic opportunity to connect our ends and our beginnings, and to have a chance to reflect on our tragic finitude. That's also what he means by equipment for living. Now, this is something that is hard to understand, but that students really get, because they're so infused with this kind of media, right? So they live in a world of still and moving images. So I'm able to talk to them about how we trade between the immediate understanding of a photograph, right, and the gradual accounting for or coming to terms with some temporally unfolding meaning, a story, right? So they catch a glimpse of how understanding is able to work across these different temporalities. The beauty of cinema now is that you can approach this transitivity from either side, from the angle of temporal becoming, sequence, and then, or from the side of the fullness of time. We have this image of the fall of Icarus, while the oblivious farmer plows the field. This is a moral tale that is instantly and immediately visible to you, right, in one image. As you experience a motion picture, it combines and moves between these two registers and moves quite naturally and fluidly. And they can see that. I mean, they are my students are already quite sophisticated readers of the temporal logics of film, because of all of this whole genre of temporal narrativity, right? How a film can subvert chronology and play with overlapping temporal orders, or use foreshadowing, right, and repetition to collapse time. And in the example I'm not going to show you, I'm going to show you a specific example right now, trades back and forth between immediate and unfolding understanding. Okay, so this is actually one of the highlights of the semester, is when they see this is a British film trilogy called Red Riding, which develops the symbol of the swan, as you see here, as a recurring visual motif that stretches across the entire three-part film series. So a story that unfolds over the course of 5 hours is unified by this central image. What I do with them first is to establish that the cultural symbol of the swan figures, on the one hand, innocence, purity, freedom, but also in its sort of peculiar mythological ambiguity, sexual violence and domination and miscegenation. And then how the film uses the ambiguity of this condensation symbol in the narrative experience as it develops over the course of the trilogy itself. So a single symbol with all its inherent ambiguity can play out temporally over the course of the plot. I show them how the film's symbolic language operates in actually 3 registers. So one, in the story structure, and the visual design as a device of foreshadowing. Second, as a sort of an index for the complex moral aspects of its subject, which is working class town in Northern England. And then third, as a summative emblem of the story's moral questions, all three. And here is an image from the last scene of the film. It's the swan imagery. All these little feathers are floating down through the air. The swan imagery works like a pedal point in the trilogy in the way that it develops this symbolic unity out of the unfolding narrative progression. And the students see this concretely when I have them actually log, they actually go through one of the films and log each instance of the figure of the swan. And then in groups, they interpret the different uses across the whole series. And we talk about how the symbol as a vision gathers up and reflects the many often conflicting meanings that the story develops in relationship to either childhood innocence or political violence. And then this comes to a head in the culminating scene, which you see here, the rescue of an abducted child out of a poultry slaughterhouse where she'd been hidden. And it's this ecstatic scene of rebirth and redemption expressed within the figural idiom as an uneasy composite of goodness and evil, right? So the logic of narrative art, unlike the logic of the proposition, welcomes contradiction, paradox, plurality of meaning. So when the students see the relationship between this summative image and the complications and crises and reversals of the plot, they understand what Ricoeur means when he says that a plot is a configuring operation that condenses a succession into a figure. Which is going back to the ontological valence of narrative understanding that I started with. It's a sort of a makeshift way that human understanding attempts to reconcile, or at least place in conversation, its very fractured becoming, its longing for permanence and beauty and its failure to achieve those things. So Ricoeur takes us quite a ways through this approach to narrative film. All right, so that was my second example, and my last and remaining example for you is the public speaking course that I teach here. And I want to go into this fairly carefully. It's a fuller example of hermeneutic instruction. It's now the basis of not just a sort of a course that a student could take, because it's one of the 3 gateway courses to the general education at Indiana University. So if you come here as an undergraduate in the college, you're going to take this course, right? It's one of the 3: math, writing, and speaking. So you have to imagine how many people this is reaching. There's about 2,200 college students who take the course each year. And now there's an additional 3,000 high school students through an advanced placement program who teach the course. We have over 100 high school teachers throughout the state, Indiana, and now into Illinois that teach it. And we train about 30 new graduate students every year. And so you see it has a big imprint. It has a potential for reaching a lot of folks and for sort of seeding the ground for what I'm trying to do with it. Something very strange and unique about this situation is that when I came here as the course director was that I was allowed to construct the curriculum for the course all by myself without any oversight. No one told me what I had to do. I had to sort of meet some state standards, which are fairly simple, but I could teach the course from scratch and invent the material that I wanted. I actually wrote my own textbook for the course. So I made this fairly radical decision to throw out the standard curriculum. And I had sort of the typical what I call the standard conventional curriculum is a speech of self-introduction, then a speech of information or description, then a persuasive speech, which is the usual foundation of the public speaking course, and then some type of ceremonial, toasting a speech. These are the 4 genres that are typical in almost every US university that now teaches public speaking. And so what I did instead was I created a sort of a hybrid of hermeneutic and critical approaches to speech and listening that build up over the course and as the semester moves along as the basic competence of speech. And in doing that, I was able to include the driving pedagogical interests of the university to give students communication skills. So we do plenty of that. We give them lots of practice in delivery and so forth. And we anchor the skills approach, though, in this hermeneutic comportment that I'm showing you here in the bottom, seeing speech as culturally constitutive, seeing audiences as co-determiners of meaning, seeing culture as symbolic all the way down, and seeing egalitarian communities as agonistic. And I'll go through this with you. My strategy in constructing this curriculum was to engage students from the outset in the difficult task of forming a vibrant public space within their speech labs, and as a project of discovering ethical community. So we set aside what's typical of the standard conventional curriculum, which would be, the ideology of individualism and instrumentalism and competition and persuasion that's at work, and then we work at developing a critical awareness of the power of speech to either dominate and manipulate others or build ethical community. Here, one of our regular graduate instructors reported that by the end of the term, and I'm quoting her here now, students tell me that P155, and that's the number for the course, is the only class they've ever taken in which they feel they know not just 1 or 2 other students, but everyone in the class. So it really does. And that also helps in terms of their speech anxiety. If they feel they've got each other's back, the anxiety tends to diminish rapidly. Okay, so now I've developed 4 formal speeches, as I said, that mirror the 4 standard conventional speeches. And the names of my courses speeches are: first, the speech of public community; second, the sympathetic perspective speech; third, the invitational speech; and fourth, the transformational speech. Because the assignment sheets for these 4 speeches form the backbone of the curriculum, I'll describe each of the one in turn and give you a brief taste of what they sound like. I'll let you hear a student say a few words till you get the flavor of it. Okay, so here's the first one. Right from the start, we get students in the project of creating a democratic classroom which shifts the locus of identity from me to we. So in preparing their introductions, they stand next to each other and introduce each other rather than themselves, right? So they're required to interview and learn about each other and develop social bonds and the habit of encouraging a dialogic interpersonal habit of mind right from the start. They do this in the first week. By the way, what you see in yellow here is the assignment instruction, or at least part of it. The social work that students do in preparing their speech content by meeting with each other and exchanging life experiences begins to create this social bond that contributes to the sense of community that the labs are designed to encourage. I have to tell you, this is my particular bugaboo, that the artifice of the classroom speech, those of you who teach speech know this, is one of, it often encourages students to sort of deliver this cookie cutter, machinic, rote, mechanized speech to nobody, nowhere, right? From nobody and nowhere, like robots. Instead of sort of making contact with the people directly in front of them, the warm, living, breathing human beings that are directly in front of them, that's really hard for us to get them to do, but we make a real effort for that. we start by breaking this habit right from the outset with this sort of active community friendship. And the explicit content goal of this first speech is to share things about their partners that are unique or special and contribute to the diverse richness of their community. This assignment goal seems benign and innocuous and unobjectionable, but it establishes the most challenging and volatile through line of the course, which is to appreciate and respond to the enriching and disruptive implications of difference, of differing values and worldviews. We found that scaffolding this learning goal in this way obviates, or at least mitigates, the defensiveness and aggression that abrupt confrontation with which cultural difference sometimes invites. You can imagine why that's important in the United States now, when we've become a culture that's so divided, right? So this course becomes more, not less, important as a part of the curriculum. When I run a lab myself, which I often do, we stand in a circle in the second class meeting and just go around introducing each other. I always have the students stand up whenever possible, because then it's easier to do it on speech day, right? So as we go around, I weave the philosophy of community and dialogue with difference, dialogue with difference, into these first efforts. And this act then connects the lessening of student performance anxiety to the conscious act of building community, right? The whole course becomes that act. Now here's the second speech, what I call the sympathetic perspective speech. The standards public speaking curriculum is anchored in the goal of good old-fashioned persuasion, which is which can be in its crass version, a sort of commercial, sort of the used car salesman, right? Or the slick politician. It's how to close the deal, how to win friends and influence people. And probably the most radical thing I did was to throw out the persuasion speech, right? Our second formal speech, which I call the sympathetic perspective speech, throws a wrench into the expectations of many students, because many of them had public speaking in high school, and they're expecting to give speeches that start and end in their own convictions, right? I get to express myself. But the assignment is intentionally designed to interrupt that expectation, right? So if instead of attempting to convert their classmates to the speaker's position on a controversial topic, we ask the students to occupy the speaker to occupy the different perspectives on a controversial topic of their audience, right? So, and it's not a both sides sort of speech. It's a sensitive exploration of the worldviews of the folks in front of them. A student is asked to inhabit the worldviews that support a position. So here's the learning goal that I've typed down here at the bottom of this picture for this speech. It's to cultivate the inclination to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And this means to embody the affective and ethotic dimensions of the diverse audience in front of you. When they do it right, the speaker models, and I have this hyphenated, models the type of person who can do that, right? The student must ask with others, what would it be like to think and feel from this place, right? And the student students who do this right aren't opposed. They're feeling their way into an alien perspective, right? And inviting others to do the same. And by the way, you'll recognize here the ethical habit of mind that's at the very center of truth and method. So this cultivation of a habit of openness sets the table for the remaining speeches, because cultivating this comportment opens the classroom up to the negotiation of communal identity that we hope in the end will be transformational. Here's just a snippet of a speech so you can just see the kind of affect or the disposition that we're trying to develop.
Just here in Indiana, a slaughterhouse had over 900 workers who became infected with COVID-19 in the beginning of May. Confronted with this reality, things get even worse because many of these workers come from a vulnerable population. Their wages make them low income, and according to the American Enterprise Institute's 2019 estimates, 30 to 50% of the workforce is composed of undocumented workers or immigrants. This means that these workers don't have access to healthcare or virtually any safety net if they fall ill. And if they get sick, their family members are likely going with them. This is all particularly concerning because many workers are coming out and saying that companies aren't taking the proper measures to protect their health.
Okay, so that's the second speech. Now, the third speech is what I call the invitational speech, and it builds on the disposition that you just saw. As one of our instructors put it, and I'm quoting her now, without the invitational speech, the perspective speech is pointless, and the transformational speech is impossible. Yeah, the third speech is really kind of the pivot of the whole course. It's an invitation to find and consider the common ground on which diverse groups could find a starting point for agreement, and then perhaps move a few degrees, Perelman calls this degrees of adherence, a few degrees towards each other on a fraught public issue. The argumentation strategy of the speech here is a hybrid of two sources that I have up on the screen. The logic is to locate an already existing common ground of value or belief. I call this a commonplace. It's a rhetorical term, on which to leverage the move to an unfamiliar or uncomfortable new place. So when the student is planning their speech, they begin to anticipate the range of possible movement they want to create, those degrees of adherence, and they build from the audience to themselves rather than the reverse. That's the key here. They locate their starting points in the common places of their composite audience rather than in their own belief system. And they have to sort of reverse engineer back from where their audience is to where they are. One important outcome of the strategy is that it actually encourages the opening up of the speaker's own position. And this is a key point, which can take place at different stages in the speech process. It could be taking place in the preparation because they have to figure this out, right? The performance itself, or the Q&A that happens after the speeches, the question and answer period where the other students get a chance to interrogate the speaker, or the self-reflection assignment to the speech. They have to watch their own speech on video and do a self-reflection. One of our high school instructors reported on the transformative experience of a devoutly religious anti-abortion student who, in the process of developing the speech in her classroom with another student, began to modify her ask because of the respect she gained from their feedback at various stages in the process. She didn't change her belief or her belief system, but she modified how she would approach others. And then we ask students to locate their starting points in their peers' experience. It really changes the tenor and the substance of their arguments. The way that we often put this is it makes the room smaller. And doing it in this way, we avoid any kind of superficial etiquette, which the invitational speech is sometimes thought to promote. That kind of etiquette speech is sort of unconnected to the argument of the speech. So with this speech, the ethos and the pathos or logos are bound to each other. Here's just a little clip of a student speech so you can get just the flavor of it.
Now I want you as students who can put yourselves and their shoes better than anyone to try to imagine the fear that these students felt as they heard guns firing in the place of a bell ringing. Right now, you're all imagining a scenario of what would happen if I was in that situation. But for students like my brother and thousands of others, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. But of course, you don't think of it like that, right? That could never happen to you in your town.
Okay, so you see, so she's saying you, she's speaking directly to her audience. And that's what we want to try to
Now I want you as students.
develop. All right, so here's the last speech of the course, the most challenging one. If we stopped at the third speech, the curriculum could be fairly accused of a kind of civic idealism, especially in the face of, in the case of the US, the sort of the kabuki theater that often affects so much of our political life now, in the name of democratic practice. Although it's crucial to model an ideal democratic practice, democratic community for students as a sort of an aspirational standard, right? That habituation alone doesn't help students see or address the dangers that lurk within political community. So here I'm sort of shifting from Gadamer to recur and beyond even recur. So we add to the virtuous practice of democratic debate an instruction in the practice of resistance through interruption, intervention, subversion, and disruption. Now, we do this in a way that doesn't destroy the community that students have worked so hard to create. And we do it by asking students to look at the language and the symbols that they and their peers are using when discussing a hard controversy. I have to tell you, this is a really key move that we make that's so important for this fourth speech. It's a kind of an indirect bank shot. I don't know. I didn't know what a way to translate that idiom. It's in the game of pool when you hit the ball against the wall rather than hit the ball that you're trying to hit into the hole. So it's a bank shot. It's indirect. That creates a kind of buffer between the deep emotional investments that students have on certain issues and the speech's argument. I think I want to actually read the instruction to this transformation that you're looking at, because I think you'll see how we've distilled this down into a speech. In this speech, you're going to break through your audience's entrenched perspective on a vibrant public controversy and attempt to reconfigure the worldview underneath that perspective. To effect this transformation, you'll need to unveil the values supporting the outlook by identifying and interpreting the commonplaces of its discourse. You will identify and attack one of these commonplaces, and we call it the master signifier, as a way to first undermine and then reconfigure the network of commonplaces and the perspective it supports. You are aiming for a paradigm shift. That's why it's called the transformational speech. We're not asking them to argue that people should change their mind on an issue. We're asking them, as Gadamer says, to change themselves. This method, by the way, connects to the two guiding terms of the course. This is something I'm very proud of because it's quite elegant. There are just two basic concepts that unite everything in the course: commonplaces and perspectives, right? The idea of the commonplace that was introduced in the invitational speech is explored in this case not as the topical starting point for an argument, right? But as the symbolic activator of a belief system, as a shorthand or a ready-made that passes along and carries social values in the cultural memory and the imagination of a discourse community. Such commonplaces, we teach them, come to us in all shapes and sizes, and you have various different examples of them here that sort of symbolize, embody the ideology of the American dream, right? So bywords, slogans, memes, hashtags, truisms, maxims, catchphrases, lyrics, and so on. They spread across social media as words, images, narratives, objects, ritual actions. This is the thing about commonplaces. They're not just limited to words and phrases. They can be, even in Bourdieu's sense and in Foucault's sense, a practice, right? A habit, a habitual practice. So we get them to enumerate these symbol systems as networks, as interrelated commonplaces. and then to look for the power that's operating underneath them as they impinge on their controversial issue. And the way that the students do this in the speech is to identify one master term or symbol that's circulating in their culture, explain how it's tapping into and then triggering a whole discursive network of associated commonplaces, as an ideology or worldview. To see how a master term can actuate that worldview. So when you say Ilhan Omar now, it's, the certain discourse communities have been acculturated into understanding that to sort of resonate with a bunch of other, right, commonplaces and value system, and to develop an entire value system. And then they have to make a rhetorical intervention as a way to destabilize and interrupt that worldview. And it's sort of like pulling out a block in a Jenga tower, if you know that, or maybe a card out of if you use playing cards and you build them up, just pull one playing card out. Their speech attempts to provoke a paradigm shift by subverting that master term. And they can do this one of two ways. They can either repurpose a master commonplace. So for example, you could take the commonplace Muslim American or Muslim, or you could sort of repurpose that concept rhetorically, or you could swap it out for another one. So you could swap out illegal alien. You could swap out the term illegal alien for undocumented worker, right? As the master term. I'm sure you recognize the Gadamerian roots of this approach, what he refers to in the tradition as the sensus communis, also what he talks about in terms of scopus theory, perspective, and the interruption of expectations that constitutes the movement of the Hermetic circle. All of those things are part and parcel of this speech strategy. But the idea of the commonplace network, which is already deeply rooted in classical rhetoric, is for me also an umbrella term that has a much greater breadth of meaning beyond Gadamerian hermeneutics. It extends into critical and postmodern and biopolitical frameworks. You can relate it to affective assemblages or dispositifs or Latourian nodal networks or Laclau and Mouffe's articulations, right? It has really, really vast applications. Here's a snippet of a student proposing to repurpose a commonplace, just a small minute or so of Pablo's attempt to do that.
So if you haven't guessed, what I'm going to try to do today is take this one word, this one great, pure idea of feminism, and try to bring it back to a good light from the bad meaning that it's been given by some people. So to start, I want to read the Merriam-Webster Dictionary's definition of feminism. And feminism is, simply put, the theory of political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. This is clearly not wrong. I don't think anybody would have a problem with this equality between sexes. And during their history, this is what feminism and feminist movement have been doing with such movements as the suffrage, women's suffrage, the fight for equal rights, women liberation marches, amongst many others. And even today, the Me Too movement is a great example of what a feminist movement should be. And again, the very first thing you see when you enter the Me Too movement website, the very first thing that is written on the homepage is the words, "You are not alone. Join the movement, support survivors, and end sexual violence." Again, this is clearly not wrong. This is something we should all be supporting. End of sexual violence, supporting the victims of sexual violence. This is something very good. But then why does Me Too and many other movements from the fourth wave of feminism, which is what they're calling feminism today, have been ridiculized, have been hated on? Why is there so much hate on feminism?
So you can see there, he's analyzing the speech, which is what we're trying to get them to do. So by placing this technique within a public speaking practice, I'm trying to give students agency to reshape the discursive networks they inhabit. They aren't just critiquing power relationships, but engaging with each other in a practice of reflective intervention in their own emergent identities. They're interrupting each other's presuppositions and cherished beliefs and negotiating each other's difference. And this animates the dialectic of distance and belonging that both Gadamer and Ricoeur identify with hermeneutic understanding. I want to close with a quotation of one of our high school instructors. By the end of the course, many of our undergrads begin to appreciate what this curriculum is doing, but even more, the graduate students who teach the course and the high school teachers, I think, fall in love with this course. I kid you not, and appropriated principles into their other teaching assignments. So here's a statement about the course.
This is the most. I mean, the word transformational comes to mind because that is what happens to these students with an audience-centered approach. Instead of them, they are blown away when they come in and they find out, oh, wait, what? I don't get to just talk about what all the things I think, right? Yeah. And it's really powerful. And it transforms them as human beings. They grow up.
Yeah.
It goes right back into what we were reading in the articles about being civically engaged and mindful and relationally connected in community, to be able to be different and diverse within our communities and neighborhoods and workplaces, but yet still be able to understand and respect those perspectives and understand them and reach common ground and all those things. I think that all these kids are coming out of P155. If they really, really attach to the experience, they will have a profound effect in their majors, in their workplaces as they go on. I think it is a solid base that transforms them to newness.
So those four women that you saw there were all high school instructors. Every summer we run a little graduate seminar for high school instructors who would like to study the readings that underline the course, right? And so they get to read Sonia Foss and all these people that I showed you in the thing. And that's them. We did a Zoom session that year where they were talking about this course. So that's what I have. I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope you're able to hear what I was saying about those, and I'm really anxious to get your feedback on this. I think what I'm going to do is stop sharing and come back to the Zoom room, and have some discussion with you.
John, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was amazing for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Arthos, for sharing such an enlightening perspective and practical perspective that surely made us re-evaluate our teaching practices. I'm sure about that. Okay. No sé si hay comentarios, preguntas. Laura, no sé si querés vos seguir.
Sí, claro. Pueden, si quieren, también escribir en el chat, si prefieren escribir, o directamente abrir el micrófono o levantar la mano, como cada uno o cada una prefiera.
I have a question, John, but I switch it to Spanish because it's tu exposición me hace pensar en un desafío para la universidad en general, y es que de alguna forma, la universidad ha claudicado su vocación a la formación integral de los estudiantes, es decir, a la formación ética de los estudiantes. Y se ha recluido tan solo en la instrucción. Y esa formación integral supone...
Sí, por favor. Entonces yo trato de tener una idea de un número de lo que ustedes necesitan.
Y esa formación supone, o más bien debería culminar en una transformación de los estudiantes. Es decir, al menos en una nueva capacidad para evaluar críticamente sus propios prejuicios, sus propios lugares comunes, ¿no? En ese sentido, tu propuesta me parece que da en el centro de este problema. Y es que, ¿cómo ves esto de el rol que la filosofía debe tener para esa formación o ese momento de Bildung, es decir, de formación integral de los estudiantes?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Carlos. So we're all in this predicament now, aren't we? At Indiana University is no different. We're moving steadily toward the language that I hear a lot is sort of a neoliberal model of education, by which I understand is meant sort of towards this more purely vocational and careerist orientation. So it's very, very troubling, and it's happening. It's like it feels as though like we're tilting at windmills to try to prevent that from happening. So it's very, very hard. So I think that's why I use the metaphor of the Cyclops, right? Odysseus and the Cyclops, because I think you have to kind of sneak this in, right? So the public speaking, there's a lot of pressure and it's coming from all directions, right? I think probably mostly from students who really just want the skills, right? They just want to know how to do this without anxiety. And so, you know, this technique that I developed, this curriculum that I developed for the public speaking course, is sort of sailing against the predominant winds, right? And I will be honest with you that the first 3 or 4 years I taught this course, it didn't work very well. We hadn't figured out the formula for it to make it work. It took some years for me to sort of gradually adjust it to get to this point now where, because it's a required public speaking course, also, by the way, it's taught by graduate students who are not in speech communication or in English or in writing. It's an across the curriculum instructional force. So we have graduate students who teach math and chemistry and biology and criminal justice and everything, right? Teaching, and we only have 1 week to train them. We have 1 week in August, 5 days to train them, and then we have staff meetings every week. So the students are taking a course. First of all, they're taking a required course, which they typically don't like. They're teaching in the gen ed, which they typically don't like. They're taking a course that's taught by instructors who are not trained in the discipline, and they're taking a public speaking course, which they typically don't like because they're afraid, right? And so all of these things mitigate against this course, and that made it a real challenge to figure out how to do all of those things, and then also this additional thing that I wanted to do. The one thing I had going for me was that there was nobody leaning over my shoulder saying how I should teach the course in the curriculum. So I had the chance to sort of develop over time this system that seems to be working. And as I say, the instructors come to really love this. For the students right now, I would say for some of them, it's okay, right? It's an okay course. For many of a number of them do really themselves also love it and start to appreciate its transformative effects. I have to say more and more that's happening now. But in terms of the system, right, I'm kind of sort of sneaking it in under the radar.
Eso significa, John, que la retórica o que has constituido a la retórica como el hilo de vinculación de todas esas diversas disciplinas y a través de la retórica, la reflexión filosófica.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, it's a fairly, what do I want to say? A fairly ambitious, right? Approach that I'm taking. I'm seeing this course, which sits at the gateway to the general education, by not understanding as it a basic skills course. I mean, it does that. It teaches the basic competencies, but seeing it as really this sort of introduction to the liberal arts, which is what it should be, right? We've lost track of that. The public speaking course and the writing course together should be the gateway to the humanities and the liberal arts and all that that means, right? And so, you know, there's only so much you can do in a semester, right? And so we sort of drop some seeds here, but I think this sort of the approach that I'm trying is a way to make a few steps in that direction. That sort of to return these courses to their original purpose. If you go back, you know, to Quintilian and Cicero, that was the function of a rhetorical education. A rhetorical education for them was essentially a liberal arts education. You know, Quintilian from A to Z, if you read, that's his institutes, all 5 volumes are about an education in what it means to be a human being and living in a community, right? An ethical human being living in a community. And so that's the basic, that's the seed for all of that. So in a way, I'm not doing anything that is at all underhanded or right, that the metaphor of the Cyclops, of the analogy of the Cyclops might suggest. It's not at all underhanded. It's just taking us back to our roots.
Muchas gracias.
I will say that these courses are really ambitious. I guess if I'm going to have to teach undergraduate courses, which is most of what I teach, I do want to be interested. I do want to remain interested in these courses. But I find that by attaching these exciting ideas to the things that students, you know, already live in and with, right? So all of them are always watching, you know, Game of Thrones and Harry Potter, and they love talking about, you know, the revenge genres, the different ways and the logic of the genres. So I've already got them in a place where they're invested, heavily invested. And when I do that, I can take them quite a bit further and be much more ambitious theoretically. I couldn't give them a straight theory course. It would be too hard. But if I can anchor it in something that they already know and love, and then the pre-law students, right, the pre-law students really, really, really want to know this stuff, right? So as long as I sort of temper my ambitions, right, to take them not too far, right, but sort of to wrap their brains around these very, very difficult concepts, they will go there with you because they want to.
quisiera hacer una pregunta al profesor Arthos.
Sí, Silvia.
Please.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. La verdad que sintetizo en una pregunta, pero surgieron varias a lo largo de su disertación. Me interesa, una refiere a una información y luego una pregunta que tal vez usted pueda explayarse. ¿En qué altura de su carrera, qué nivel de formación tienen los estudiantes que toman este curso? ¿Son estudiantes que recién ingresan a la universidad? ¿Son estudiantes avanzados? Esto por un lado, para poder configurar el estado de situación que ha descrito.
Right.
Pregunta que, perdón, si me permite, le hago la otra pregunta y completamos. ¿Qué dicen los colegas de las otras disciplinas que no pertenecen a las ciencias humanas respecto de esta formación? Porque creo que está en tensión lo que Carlos planteaba recién con su pregunta, esta discusión entre la formación general y la formación específica en la universidad, cualquiera sea la disciplina que se trate. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Yeah, those are both great questions. So I would say, with regard to the first question, the three different courses that I shared with you are very, very different. So the film and the law course are third-year courses. So juniors in college, we have a 4-year college system. First-year students, sophomores, juniors, seniors. So the 300 level course is for junior level students, although I do have seniors in there. So these are students who are fairly well along in the curriculum. So they're more mature and they're able to handle these things more. The exception to that is the public speaking course, which is a 100 level course. Now we actually, because many of them avoid taking public speaking as long as they can, they do come in as sophomores and juniors and seniors as well. They can take it any time, but the course is a 100 level course. So that one is. Now, also don't forget, that's also taught at the high school level in the advanced placement. So it actually took me, that's part of what I had to figure out and what I had to correct. I was too ambitious when I taught the course at the beginning in my first years. In the first, I would say 3 or 4 years, I tried to pack too much in, and I had to gradually pull back and make it more accessible. And that had a lot to do with the language I used and so forth. So one of the things that made it work was that I distilled or reduced the course down to 2 basic concepts: commonplaces and perspectives. So all through the course, they're running into those 2 concepts, and they're just using them in different ways. So I eventually, just by a process, a slow and painful process, frankly, of tweaking the course and listening to the student evaluations, was I able to get it to the place where not only can the students absorb it, but the instructors who are not trained in rhetoric can learn to teach it very quickly. Although they're aided by all of the materials that I provide, the textbook, I have the little mini, instead of having lectures, I have little 12-minute video tutorials is what I call them. And then I produce all of these course materials, including a lot of classroom exercises. And I will tell you that a big thing that makes the public speaking course work is that the labs are basically like coaching experiences where the lab instructors are not lecturing at all. You go into the labs and it's all practical exercises. You're standing up, moving around, doing all kinds of fun exercises. When they create their networks of associated commonplaces, they'll act it out, right? They will write their commonplace on a card and they will form circles. You saw pictures of that, right? And so they're doing a lot of active learning in the labs, And that really makes it possible to do that. So as I say, it did take me a long time to figure out how to make this stuff accessible to students who don't, because it is a state university, right? It's not, I used to teach, I taught for 14 years at a small liberal arts college, which was a very elite little college, which had only, I don't know, I think 4,000 students. No, less than that, 3,000 students. And they were very high performing students. I could throw a lot at them that I couldn't at this school. But here, because it's a big state school, I have to sort of modify my ambitions, and gradually over time, I sort of figure out a way to do that. So yeah, it is ambitious, but through tempering my expectations and working over time, I can figure out a way to make it happen. So it's not the sort of thing that you can do easily, right? And then I have to remember what your second question is. Can you start me off on the second question, because I've forgotten what the second.
Sí, cómo no. Tiene que ver con las repercusiones de colegas, de profesores de otras disciplinas, no del campo de las humanidades.
Right. Yeah. So again, that was something that also had to evolve over time, because I had to so let me give you an example. Because the course is taught by graduate students from all disciplines, we had to figure out a way to allow them the sort of the freedom, right? The degrees of freedom to teach the course in a way that they would be able to feel comfortable with. And so we created this idea of a disciplinary lens, that you can bring a disciplinary lens to your lab experiences. And that turns out to work very nicely. The grad students who come from, say, astronomy invite students to pick topics that are having to do with the cosmos and whatnot, or criminal justice they bring in, or, the German language instructors will bring in German music. And so they find ways to adapt the labs to their own disciplinary experience. And so that was very, very helpful when we did that. And then we also had to make sure that the curriculum did in fact teach the basic skills, right? In other words, even though we're doing all of these other things that are basically overlays, they are learning how to speak clearly, to stand up and explain, to describe, to argue. Even though our mode of argumentation is rhetorical and hermeneutic, they are learning. We have a whole section on how to connect starting points with conclusions through warrants, right? And so they're learning critical thinking skills and the basic skills that all of the schools expect of this course. So we do not stint on that. So that's part of how we negotiated this. So I will say, Sylvia, that this was not easy to do, right? It took the years that I've been working on this to, and the nice thing about it is that it's iterative, right? I can keep going back. Every semester we go back and figure out some way to improve it. And it's very often just these little adjustments that we're able to make that make it work for everybody. And so at the beginning, we did have, I would have the chair of the Department of Biology come up to me and say something, ask me a question, which was clearly a critical question. And then so I understood what was going on. And so I tried to sort of figure out how could I accommodate that concern, right? I think a lot of the folks in the sciences wanted their students to be able to go to a science conference and give a clear presentation. Clarity is very important for them. But the truth of the matter is it's very hard not to get through this course and improve the clarity of your demonstration. So I think eventually we were able to allay those concerns, and right now we're not getting concerns. I'm not getting. It's something that that seems to be really not an issue as much anymore.
Muchas gracias.
Could I hear a little bit about your program, because I'm so interested in why hermeneutics has come is a subject that you study.
La hermenéutica no está incluida en el currículum ni siquiera de la carrera de filosofía. Eso para mí es una ventaja nuestra. Nosotros somos un pequeño centro en la universidad, pero esa es una ventaja porque nos permite ser lo que queremos ser, que es un lugar de conexión entre las diversas disciplinas y áreas, ¿no? Porque la hermenéutica como teoría y práctica de la comprensión nos permite dialogar con diversas disciplinas, con derecho, con comunicación, con ciencias políticas. Yo creo que uno de los obstáculos con lo que nos enfrentamos, al menos yo pienso eso respecto de la filosofía. Nuestro centro es originalmente un centro de hermenéutica filosófica. La dificultad que nos encontramos es que yo estoy bastante horrorizado de cómo se enseña filosofía en las distintas carreras que no son filosofía. Porque lo único que se logra es transmitir una serie de instrucción que termina siendo mal comprendida, que termina siendo odiada por los estudiantes y que no les reporta ningún beneficio. Porque la filosofía ha renunciado a ser una escuela del pensamiento, ¿no? Justamente en estos días tuvimos un seminario con un profesor muy joven de la Universidad de Navarra en España, exponiendo un texto que todos conocemos, que es el Sofista de Platón, y donde mostraba él que justamente lo que hace ahí, bueno, Heidegger interpreta ese texto diciendo lo que Platón hace allí es mostrar o enseñar lo que es la filosofía, poniendo en práctica la filosofía, poniendo en práctica la discusión, la argumentación y finalmente la puesta en crítica de los propios prejuicios. Y yo creo que esto es lo que sucede en la universidad. La universidad en la enseñanza de la filosofía en las otras disciplinas. Yo estoy, de los que está aquí, debo ser el único que estuvo desde el primer momento de la creación de nuestra universidad, que es joven. Nuestra universidad comenzó en el año 93, y desde el primer momento quisimos que la filosofía estuviese presente, y está presente en todos los programas de estudio. Pero la dificultad con que nos hemos encontrado es que ha terminado siendo la filosofía una materia de instrucción de doctrinas filosóficas y no una asignatura que enseñe a pensar, a reflexionar y por tanto a hablar, ¿no? La retórica es fundamental para la filosofía, ¿no? Y en verdad hay mucha resistencia en los profesores a esto, los profesores de filosofía. Y hay también, y la otra pregunta que quería hacerte, es cómo instruir, cómo preparar esos profesores para que puedan enseñar a pensar, y utilizar la tradición filosófica para enseñar a pensar. ¿De qué nos sirve a nosotros que nuestros estudiantes de economía, por ejemplo, aprendan 3 o 4 ideas sueltas de Platón, 3 o 4 ideas sueltas de Aristóteles, Hegel o quien sea, y después nunca sean capaces de tener una mirada crítica, distanciada respecto a los modos de pensar que ellos han heredado? Que esto está en el corazón de lo que es la filosofía, la mirada, es decir, la razón crítica. La filosofía en Grecia nació como razón crítica, ¿no? Y esto yo creo que es dramático para la filosofía, ¿no? Y cuando me encuentro con estudiantes que, nosotros tenemos muchos estudiantes de filosofía, es la segunda universidad en el país que en número de estudiantes por año. Y cuando uno dialoga con esos estudiantes, muchos de ellos han llegado porque se han encontrado en el secundario con un profesor de filosofía que ha hecho esto con ellos. Los ha ayudado a pensar, los ha motivado, los ha creado una actitud crítica, ¿no? Y después en la universidad hacemos todo lo contrario.
Yeah. So I so sympathize with this problem. And it's an institutional problem, isn't it? And the problem, in addition to that now, is that there is a sort of a momentum to move closer, more in that direction. I will say one thing. So I think we have to, my metaphor of the Cyclops, I think we have to continue to find ways. I mean, that's always been the case, right? I mean, for example, public speaking, for a long time in the United States, the great Eastern, the great universities on the Eastern coast, Harvard and Yale, and would not teach public speaking to their students because they thought it was beneath them, right? And so what happened was these street corner public speaking instructors started just doing it on their own. They would put up the shingles and they would teach public speaking to whoever, they would charge students a little fee, and they started doing it on the street in shops. And then eventually some of them were brought into the university that way. So they found a way to do these things. And so I think one of the advantages of Zoom we're seeing is that there may be some ways to get around, right, these institutional barriers and these institutional structures and this calcification, right? So for example, let me give you 2 examples. During COVID, a really enterprising Gadamer scholar from Kalamazoo, Michigan, from Grand Rapids, Michigan, David Vesey, started running a reading group that met every 2 months, just once every 2 months. And the group picked an essay, a Gadamer essay, to read carefully and then discuss for a couple of hours on Sunday. And that's been going now for 2 years, and it's attracting all kinds of new people all the time, people from all over the world. And then it has these wonderful people who step, Jean Grandin, the great Canadian Gadamerian, regularly comes to it. And James Risser, the great Gadamerian from out west. And so that's something that is that there's no tuition involved, there's no admission involved. You just, if you want to participate, you read the text and come and discuss it. And that's like a very, very old school idea, right? Another initiative that started during COVID is called the Hermeneutics in Real Life Project. And I'm actually helping run that. And that their format is different every year. Last year, the format was that they had a prominent speaker that gave a presentation, and they did this once a month for the season. This year, we're doing a roundtable series where we're only having 4 major roundtables of thinkers that are involved in various different topics related to hermeneutics. Like tomorrow, we're having a digital hermeneutics roundtable. a couple months ago, I ran a roundtable on violence and war. We're going to be doing one on hermeneutics and money, of all things. And then we're going to be doing one on hermeneutics and I forget how it's phrased, but it has to do with the general education in the spring. So and that's the same structure. Now, there's no fee, there's no barriers to entry. You just can come. And so our idea here is that we can sort of seed interest, and people don't have the opportunity to do it because of these kinds of calcified structures that you're discussing. Will at least have an opportunity to get this kind of experience with other folks, you know, with established scholars and with graduate students and so forth. So I think we have to continue trying, you know, to move our institutions along as best we can, but then also not to wait as well, to find ways to help sort of keep this thing going. And I think that was my original idea with the public speaking course. It's why I moved to Indiana to do this, because I felt as though hermeneutics, as I say, hermeneutics in the United States is really dying out. It's really no longer a fashion at all, right? It doesn't have a place in departments and so forth. But there's ways in which we can keep it alive, I think, because does continue to be an interest. And Carlos, what you described, the way it functions in your institution, I think that's incredibly valuable, right? And so you're sort of modeling for others how it functions, right, in the way that we've been talking about today.
Yo he hecho este año una experiencia por fuera de la universidad, basada en este diagnóstico, y es que la gente necesita conversar y necesita poder conversar sobre algo que realmente existencialmente les interese. Entonces armé grupo por Zoom, armé grupos por fuera de la universidad, ¿no? Grupos de conversación. Yo hago una pequeña introducción y luego yo dirijo el debate, ¿no? Tengo público del más diverso, digamos, artistas, jueces, psicólogos, que vienen porque les interesa, ¿no? Nada más, es gratuito, digamos, ¿no? Y bueno, para mí ha sido un gran desafío porque se trata de presentar un tema. Ahora en un grupo el tema es el desafío de la esperanza, tratar de acercarnos a qué significa humanamente la esperanza, qué puede significar. En otro encuentro usamos una frase de Spinoza, no te olvides de vivir, y dimos vueltas por meses alrededor de esa frase. El desafío de la esperanza hace 4 o 5 meses que estamos reuniéndonos todas las semanas, 2 horas, y la verdad que es una experiencia muy interesante porque veo y vienen profesionales que yo digo, ¿por qué viene esta gente, no? Y vienen porque tienen necesidad de escucharse, y no tienen absolutamente ninguna obligación de venir, ¿no? De modo que yo creo que eso también es un lugar para recuperar, ¿no? El de la conversación, una conversación con sentido, que uno pueda salir de esa conversación y llevarse algo. Y estas personas, entre ellas, ninguna se conocía. Es decir, que también se creó una cierta comunidad, e incluso sé que muchas piensan en términos políticos, digamos, por ejemplo, muy diferentemente. ¿Sí?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And it sounds like, you know, exactly what we have to do, what we have to do more of. I will tell you just a little anecdote, a similar anecdote, in relationship to the Hermeneutics in Real Life roundtable that I gave a couple months ago. There was an Iranian scholar who contacted me 3 years ago. He was he had finished his PhD and was starting in on another PhD, but he was collected by the Iranian government and thrown in prison and tortured. And what was interesting is that he developed a relationship with his interrogator, and then finally eventually was either let out or escaped, and escaped to Turkey, and then he was pursued in Turkey, so he ended up in Canada. And he then, I kept in touch with him all of this and tried to sort of provide opportunities for him to be involved in, because he really said he was interested in hermeneutics. That's why he contacted me originally. And that's what he wanted to study. And he had no way formally to study this subject matter. And so he said, would you help me? And so the only way I was able to help him was, you know, to sort of make opportunities for him to participate in these kinds of these fora that I'm describing to you. And so he was a panelist on this roundtable that I gave, and I've forgotten, Hermeneutics in a Time of War and Violence, right? And he told the story, and it was the most moving story. The people in the audience were in tears. I was in tears. And he was, I can't tell you, he is such an eloquent speaker, and he was channeling Gadamer. I don't know how carefully he has been able to read Gadamer, but you'd think that Gadamer was in the room as he discussed his relationship with his interrogator. And so I do think we have to continue to make those kinds of efforts in order to keep this thing alive.
Muchas gracias.
A mí me gustaría compartir muy brevemente también una experiencia que hago hace muchos años y que la inicié a través de los talleres de traducción de textos filosóficos en lengua alemana, y también empezaron como una actividad en un marco institucional, y luego con los grupos que se van formando queda ese gusto, ese goce por trabajar algo en conjunto y practicar sobre todo lo que usted mencionó en un momento, que es la paciencia de la escucha. Traducimos textos y no hay autoría en la traducción, entonces es el ejercicio de escuchar cuáles son las propuestas concretas, siempre sobre un texto, en general es del siglo XIX, textos de Schleiermacher, de Schlegel, digamos, de la línea de la hermenéutica. Y lo interesante, que por eso lo menciono ahora, mencioné esta experiencia, es que muchas y muchos estudiantes, porque en general son de la universidad, pero ya se están hace años acercando gente de letras de otras universidades, y no abandonan este taller, como lo llamamos, porque lo que dicen es que aunque hayan terminado su carrera, es el lugar donde pueden compartir el pertenecer a una comunidad y no correr atrás de lo que dimos a llamar en estos grupos del paperismo, que es producir un paper atrás del otro, y que es lo que en este momento los ocupa y los preocupa a muchos de los que se reciben incluso en la carrera de filosofía, porque su perspectiva es la de empezar a escribir un paper tras otro, o dar, digamos, muchas clases. Entonces son lugares como lo que cuenta Carlos, donde pueden casi hasta dejar por un momento de lado esa necesidad de individualizarse y de cumplir con lo que hoy también se está dando, que es esta estandarización de tanto los criterios de evaluación en las carreras también de humanidades, que después significa la profesionalización, ¿no? Es decir, para presentarse, recibir una beca o algo, todo tiene que estar evaluado con un criterio cuantitativo y no en realidad cualitativo, o justamente de la capacidad de reflexión, de crítica y de producción intelectual en este sentido. Al punto que nuestro sistema, y con esto ya dejo, nuestro sistema digamos, de registro en nuestra carrera, o de los antecedentes académicos, es un sistema que responde a las ciencias duras. Es decir, no hay un lugar donde un casillero donde uno pueda poner qué es lo que produjo en humanidades. Es decir, está todo cuantificado. Sí, este sistema que se llama, bueno, el CIGEVA se llama acá, ¿no? Y esto produce en la gente, en los jóvenes que digo que son de 25, 30, 40, este goce, este placer por estar en lugares donde pueden ejercer la reflexión y la confianza intelectual, como también solemos decir, que si puedo ir cambiando de opinión, lo que usted también mencionó, con ir modificando mi manera de ver las cosas, ¿no? Así que eso quería contar nomás, como desde la lengua también hacer este trabajo gadameriano.
Yeah, that's such a splendid example. And, you know, it's almost a sort of a quasi-institutional way of trying to solve this. You know, I think that we, you know, to continue this sort of this Odyssean metaphor, you know, we just have to find a way to live in the cracks, right? As long as we can, as well as sort of pushing the institutions. But I think, you know, so that's another sort of modality of doing this, right, that you described. That's very moving, and it's really true, right? People are just motivated beyond just these very material needs. We are all motivated by the material needs, but we also have these greater needs, and so those needs are not going to go away. Even if the institutions are a bit short-sighted and they don't see that, we can keep this going. And then the other thing that you're saying reminds me, you know, it's why I continue to be, in addition to Gadamer, also interested in so much in Ricoeur, because he has this really important work on translation, right? And thinking of hermeneutic understanding as an exercise in translation. And then he also has this, he's really the one, I think, who has identified with what he calls the hermeneutics of hope, right? So I find that those two complement each other, despite the fact that they themselves, Gadamer was a little bit suspicious of Ricoeur for a number of reasons, but Ricoeur was a devoted student of Gadamer, and sort of adds dimensions to hermeneutics that I find very, very valuable.
Sí, yo solo a los nuevos, digamos, a los que se van integrando, siempre les convidamos los 3 escritos de Ricoeur sobre la traducción, esa tríada maravillosa, donde habla justamente del duelo, todo lo que significa traducir. Son 3 escritos maravillosos, sí, sin duda, sin duda.
Oh, great, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that.
Bueno, Carlos, estamos sobre la hora. No sé si alguien quiere agregar algo más.
Yo solo agregaría que me parece muy importante, o me ha dado mucho que pensar lo que has dicho, John, respecto de buscar el punto de interés del otro. Buscar aquello que al estudiante o al colega le interesa para comenzar desde allí. Porque también en esto debemos hacer, digamos, una mirada crítica hacia nosotros mismos. Si nosotros creemos en el valor de la hermenéutica como actitud disposicional para tener una mirada crítica y una mirada que pueda construir comunidad, también debemos abrirnos a los intereses de los otros. Y debemos comenzar con los intereses de los otros. Cosa que no es fácil porque significa salir de nosotros mismos y tratar de sintonizar con los intereses y necesidades de los otros. Esto no es fácil, por ejemplo, lo hemos iniciado y no nos dio buen resultado. Tenemos que seguir intentándolo con el departamento o el instituto de arquitectura. Ahora es una escuela de arquitectura, porque tenemos muchos puntos en común, digamos, respecto de la interpretación del espacio y lo que eso significa para la existencia humana. Pero ese diálogo cuesta mucho, porque cuando puse a los filósofos a dialogar con los arquitectos, los filósofos expusieron, uno expuso lo que decía Kant, otro expuso lo que decía otro, y nada, era como uno hablaba ruso y el otro hablaba japonés, y nadie entendía nada, digamos. Entonces no tuvo ningún futuro eso, ¿no?
Yeah, well, keep trying. That's great. That's a great effort. Yeah, and Recur wrote an article on hermeneutics and architecture. So yeah, so that's exactly right. We tend to talk past each other, and so, yeah, so that kind of hermeneutic humility, right, and trying to think from the perspective of the other first. Yeah, I think that's really important. Did Anna have a question? Anna raised her hand, I think.
Sí, Ana. Sí, Ana, tenía la mano levantada, pero ahora no la veo en la sala. No sé si se tuvo que retirar. Sí.
I think
Levantó la...
I think she has left.
Sí. Sí. Bueno, entonces, una vez más, muchísimas gracias, profesor Arthos. Y seguimos en contacto. Muchas gracias también a todas y a todos los que se acercaron. Varios ya avisaron un rato antes que se tenían que retirar y agradecieron y felicitaron por su exposición.
Quedará en el canal nuestro para que lo vea mucha gente.
Sí, sí. Ya,
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for all your wonderful questions and comments. Yeah, and hopefully we can remain in touch.
John, as soon as we have the recording, we will be sending it to you so that if you want to listen to it at your own.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Y por supuesto compartirla en forma libre con quien quisieras. ¿Sí? Se puede hacer circular sin ningún tipo de permiso ni nada. Es libre. Bueno, muchas gracias. Gracias a quienes interpretaron en la tarde de hoy. Gracias, Dani, y a todas y a todos los que se acercaron.
Yes.
We'll stay in contact. Okay.
Okay, folks. I will see you then.
Yes. Chao.
Bye-bye.
Chao.